All right, let's start. So thank you all so much for joining in my book launch. I am very excited for this event. My name is Janina Grabs. I'm currently a postdoctoral research associate at the Environmental Policy Lab of ETH Zurich, and I pursued my PhD in political science in the Trans-Sustain Junior Researcher Group at the University of Münster. And so this is also where I wrote my PhD, and this book is based on my PhD. It's called Selling Sustainability Short, ? The Private Governance of Labor and the Environment in the Coffee Sector. And it is published in the Organizations and the Natural Environment series at Cambridge University Press. It's already out in Europe. It was published on May 14th, and it'll be available in the US and Canada on June 18th, which is why we wanted to host the book launch in between those two dates. People that signed up to this launch include both academics and practitioners, which made me very happy because the book is definitely geared towards those two audiences. So I'll also try to strike a balance during my presentation on that. I'm fortunately not alone, so I'm being joined by two fabulous scholars to launch this book, Graeme Auld and Stefano Ponte. So I'll also take a couple of minutes to introduce them. Graeme Auld is an associate professor and director of the School of Public Policy and Administration at Carleton University. He is also a member of the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists. And he has a very long string of publications, but amongst those is his book, Constructing Private Governance, The Rise and Evolution of Forest, Coffee, and Fisheries Certification. And this book in 2016 got the Linton Keith Caldwell Prize by the American Political Science Association for the best book on environmental politics and policy, and pursues the rise of and evolution of coffee certifications in a lot of depth. So Graeme is an expert not only, but including on coffee certifications, so it's wonderful to have him join us. Stefano Ponte is a professor of international political economy and the director of the Center for Business and Development Studies at Copenhagen Business School. He has published 10 books on global value chains, standards, and environmental and social sustainability. So he has a lot more experience in book launches than I do. His latest book came out last year in 2019. It's called Business, Power, and Sustainability in a World of Global Value Chains. Highly recommended. And Stefano has established himself for a long time as a leading expert on the global value chain of coffee. Since the early 2000s, indeed, since one of his seminal articles in 2002 is called The Latte Revolution, Regulation, Markets, and Consumption in the Global Coffee Chain. And his 2005 book is also noteworthy. It's called The Coffee Paradox, Global Markets, Commodity Trade, and the Elusive Promise of Development, which he co-authored with Benoit Dabiron. And most importantly, both of them have been great, amazing co-authors and great mentors to me. So thank you guys so much for joining me in this event as well. In terms of the proceedings, we'll start by my giving around 20-minute presentation on the book, its key themes, and a little bit of the background. And then we'll entertain some comments by Graeme and Stefano, and they also prepared some questions to kick off our discussion. But we would really appreciate as many audience comments and questions as possible. So if you can use the chat box to just write down any questions, and we'll be able to answer them during the Q&A towards the end of the session. Everybody right now is on mute just to maintain a better overall ambiance, but please do feel free to use the chat box as much as possible, and Stefano and Graeme will then select from those questions towards the very end. The session is expected to last around 60 to 75 minutes, depending on how many questions we get, but feel free to duck out early as well. We are recording this session and I'll upload it to my website, and also I'll link to it on Twitter. And as always, I'd be very happy if you got in touch via email or via Twitter to continue the conversation after this launch, if there's any other questions that you feel you want to have answered. All right, So I'll get started with my motivation for writing this book in the first place. As I said, I'm a political scientist, and I have joined the community of scholars that are interested in private regulatory governance, which means spaces where business or NGOs, that is non-state actors, are making and enforcing rules on the ground. In the global governance literature, these types of private governance functions have, since the wake of globalization, been seen to have potential, very tremendous potential to substitute and or complement state functions, especially in globalized economies where impacts transcend borders. And so it was thought that those types of private regulatory efforts via sustainability standards, via certification schemes, could make a potential impact. However, as time has moved on, their effectiveness has been increasingly in question. And this is specifically the case in a lot of the agricultural sustainability space where certification schemes have popped up a lot. I pursue this question of what private certification standards can actually do or not do in the case of the coffee sector for two reasons. One, substantively, the coffee sector is a sector where sustainability needs to be improved. It connects consumers and producers from the global north to the global south in a vast number of ways. It provides the livelihoods for millions of smallholder farmers. The numbers are always changing a little bit, but the latest numbers that I saw estimate that there's around 12.5 million farms, coffee farms in the entire world, of which around 2/3 are operated by smallholders, many of which live under the poverty line. There's also social sustainability issues such as child labor or forced labor that continue to be unresolved in the coffee industry, as well as environmental issues given that coffee is grown in and around biodiversity hotspots in the subtropics. And so deforestation, soil erosion, and other types of ecosystem disruption have continued to pose challenges for the sector. In response, we've seen a tremendous proliferation of private sustainability standards, such as the ones shown on the screen. And I indeed look at all of these, so Fair Trade, Organic, Rainforest Alliance, UTZ, 4C, Starbucks Cafe Practices, and Nespresso AAA in my study. The coffee sector is a great test case to see whether private regulation works or doesn't, given that it's one of the sectors where private certification schemes have existed the longest. Indeed, one of the precursors to fair trade, the Max Havelaar scheme, emerged through a cooperation of a Dutch NGO and a Mexican coffee cooperative. It is a sector where there's a proliferation of schemes, which is interesting from an analytical standpoint, given that we can compare and contrast what rules they implement, how they implement them, and then can see whether they have different impacts on the ground. And thirdly, it is a sector where the schemes have, again, existed for a long time, but also have managed to spread into the mainstream. So today we estimate that between 40 and 50% of global produced coffee is either certified or verified with one of these schemes. So we've moved past sort of the initial stage of we need to wait and see whether things will happen to say, well, let's actually see what did happen. And this is what I do in this book. And I try to answer the research question, can market-driven governance provide effective private regulation of sustainable agricultural production? And I draw on a number of different types of data and a number of different types of methods as well. So I use a mixed method research design, which means I combine quantitative and qualitative information. On the qualitative side, I did a vast number of interviews, over 60, with different types of value chain members, ranging from the cafe owners in the global north, via roasters, traders, all the way down to coffee cooperatives and producers in the Global South, to understand their perception of certifications, the challenges they see in its implementation, and ways to go forward. I also did a lot of document analysis of the standard documents themselves, but also industry reports, newspapers. I attended a number of industry events to do participatory observation. And then with our research team, the Trans-System research team, and I want to give a shout out to my colleague Andrea Estrella, who did a lot of this data collection work jointly with me. We collected farm level data in 3 producing countries, in Honduras, Colombia, and Costa Rica. In total, we surveyed over 1,900 farmers, many of which were certified with one of the 7 standards that I showed before, but some of which are also not certified, but were similar in other underlying characteristics. And by comparing the certified to the non-certified farmers using econometric methods such as propensity score matching, we can then see what the difference is and what the impact has been of standards on the production practices of certified farmers. Let's take a peek inside of the book. After the introduction, I propose my theoretical framework, which exposes a institutional design dilemma of effective private governance, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. I then dedicate an entire chapter to what we're actually pursuing. What is the definition of a sustainable coffee sector? Given that without a goal, we can't evaluate whether we've been effective or not. But this turns out to be quite a complex question because the definition of sustainability has changed over time. It's been very contested by different types of stakeholders. And so I pursue that quest of trying to understand what sustainability even means. Then in chapter 4, I describe how certification schemes have changed the market in terms of value distribution, focusing specifically on whether price premiums are being passed down to producers, to what extent, and how else they have integrated themselves into the conventional trading system. 5th, I draw on this farm level surveys to look into different types of sustainable production practices. And I'll go more into that in a minute as well, and compare whether certified farmers in different types of schemes show better practices than their non-certified, control observations, the status quo of how coffee production looks in the countries that I analyze. 6th, I then use the comparison between different standards to compare and contrast design characteristics of standards and see whether they are associated with better or worse effectiveness on the ground, testing hypotheses that I laid out in the second chapter. And in the 7th chapter, I draw on the comparison between the 3 case studies to be able to see what difference does it make in which public institutional environment a standard lands in, right? Because we have now learned from a number of previous scholars that private governance does not come into a blank slate of no governments whatever, even if it is in an emerging economy. And what I find is actually that the institutional structures that are already in place make a vast difference in the results that we can see on the ground. So again, there's too little time to go into a lot of detail, but I like to highlight a couple of results that might be of interest. The first is this institutional design dilemma that I see private standards facing, especially in a sector that has matured quite a bit, such as the coffee sector. Because here, private standards need to pursue 2 simultaneous goals. Given the fact that they are market-driven and voluntary, that is, that producers choose to participate or not, they need to pursue persistent market-based benefits. And this is indeed what comes out of my interviews. Many producers will note that the only reason they joined, at least initially, was because of the promise of improved prices, improved market access, a way to differentiate their product from the mainstream. But at the same time, standards have wanted to exit out of their niche and move into the mainstream, and which means upscaling, reaching out to producers that they haven't reached out to before. And these 2 simultaneous goals require different design choices, both in standard setting, where if we wanted to maintain price premia, it would be better to have higher or reasonably high entry barriers that are high enough to make sure that we can protect the reputation of the sustainable from the non-sustainable product. Whereas if we want to include more marginalized farmers, it makes much more sense to have a stepwise, step-by-step approach where we're leading them by the hand in order to become more sustainable. But this also means that the initial entry into the standard needs to be lower than what otherwise would be the case. In terms of standard enforcement, we face a similar dilemma where if we want to maintain the producer rent, the benefit of being certified in an otherwise mainstream market, we would need to have quite legalistic compliance enforcement to strictly differentiate the in-group from the out-group. But this again is counterproductive if we want to include a larger number of more farmers that have lower financial or educational capacity, where here we would want to help them in their capacity to comply and have a more cooperative compliance management, where we're being more helpful rather than exclusionary. And third, in terms of standard coexistence, it would be much easier for standards to maintain market-based benefits if they moved and conglomerated into some sort of super seal that gives buyers one single option of a sustainable coffee and unifies demand for that sustainable coffee, because then it would be easier to equilibrate demand and supply of the certified product. Contrarily, if we want to spread the labels the fastest, it makes sense to pursue strategies that others have called co-opetition, which means that one segments the market and different standards will target different types of both buyers and producers. But this effectively gives buyers a much wider range of choices and opens up their potential and their opportunities to buy the cheapest sustainable product that they can, which again erodes the market-based benefits that producers might perceive. And so what I show in this book is that standards on the whole, although there are exceptions, have moved more towards the second type of upscaling and mainstreaming design choices due to the recognition that they want to reach out to more producers, they want to enter the mainstream, they want to exit out of the niche. What does it mean? One, for the benefits that producers still receive, and two, for the practices that they do. That's basically what I cover in then the third chapters 5 and 6. So in the chapter where we're looking at changing markets, I look at the development of market incentives. And what I find is that because of a range of conditions amongst which that there's cross-temporal information asymmetry, that means that producers don't really know and can't anticipate future demand and overestimated future demand of certified product, because there's no supply management by the certification schemes in question. They admit producers, no matter whether there's a market for their certified product or not. We see a replication of this collective action problem in the mainstream, in the niche market, in our sustainable coffee market, which means we have incredible oversupply. Between 50 and 75% of the certified or verified coffee is never sold as such. So it needs to go into the mainstream market. And so the coffee that is sold as certified oftentimes has seen an erosion of price premiums, because with the exception of the fair trade standard, and it's an important exception to make, other certification systems use market-based premiums, which means that the buyer and the supplier negotiate in terms of how high the certification premium will be. And of course, if there's oversupply, the premiums drop. This means, in turn, that producers have seen a steady erosion of the market benefit they get from pursuing sustainable practices. This is a problem, however, when we're looking at sustainability practices that create an opportunity cost for farmers, that is, that increase their operating cost beyond the status quo. What I show in this book is that not all sustainability practices belong into that category. Indeed, I differentiate between 3 tiers. The first tiers are practices that one can classify as sustainable intensification, which are sort of win-win practices from an environmental and economic perspective. These are things such as increasing yields while decreasing pesticide use. So you're getting a better bottom line, and also you're improving the environment. Win-win, very little opportunity costs for farmers to do these practices. The second tier are practices that require a shifting of the time horizon backwards because there's short-term costs but long-term benefits. And here the immediate opportunity costs are a bit higher, but still one can argue that the producer will see benefits along the road. The third tier and hardest practices to implement are requirements that constitute continuous costs or that are linked to yield losses, which then the producer needs to make a choice between the economics and the social or environmental sustainability benefit. And these would be practices where standards could act as payments for these ecosystem and social services. But again, in the current environment, they rarely do so. This is an overview of the practices that I look at. There's a couple more of them in the book. And a very crude aggregation of my findings. Again, there's a lot more detail also segregated by standard in the book, but what we can see as a trend is that it's easier for farmers that are certified to pursue the tier 1 practices compared to the tier 3 practices, right? So it's easier to pursue practices that are win-wins, and as we're moving towards those that create opportunity costs for farmers, we see fewer and fewer differences between certified and control and non-certified farmers. So the more green the indicator is, the stronger differences we see between certified and non-certified farmers. There's a lot more in the book, of course, and I'd be happy to expand on some of those things throughout the Q&A, but some of the conclusions that I come to are thus that certification schemes as forms of private regulatory governance can only show partial goal attainment, and only when allowing for moving goalposts towards a definition of sustainable coffee production that is very much in line with sort of sustainable intensification, where we're looking towards the farmer to improve his or her livelihood by improving their yield potential, but we're not really putting into question the pricing that exists in international markets, nor the pricing that certification schemes can pass down to the farmer. And these types, the potential of these schemes to actually rectify market failures by internalizing these social and environmental externalities, as far as I can see, and I add to my own findings also a lot of different findings that have already existed in the impact evaluation literature, it's not been realized to date. And so there's a number of reasons for that, some of which I've already mentioned. Again, this competition between standards that has led to an oversupply and a premium erosion, a loss of this differentiation potential is definitely amongst them. We can also see that some of the standards that used to be quite strong and some of the more stringent characteristics have moved away from that stringency in an effort to gain more market share. So that's another point. When I look into what different types of design features make standards more effective than others, I find that clear and non-negotiable rules, as well as prices that do cover the opportunity costs of production, are associated with higher levels of effectiveness, that is, of outcome additionality. And we can see that in a number of subgroups in my survey that actually have very strong and much more sustainable practices than their counterparts. I also look at the implication of trainings and whether they are a conduit towards better types of practices. I see that there are trainings that can be very effective. However, many times they're not widespread enough in the entire certification group to really make much of a difference on the whole. And finally, and again, I'm happy to expand more on this in the Q&A, I do find very strong national level institutional differences that then influence the ability of standards to pursue their potential. And many times what we found was that producers in different countries, or even the cooperative level differences between producers are much higher than differences between farmers in different types of certification schemes. So the institutional environment makes a lot of difference. What are some of the implications of this work? It's interesting to me that one of the movements that I see currently in the standard space is that a confirmation of this move towards standards as more of a developmental approach, with having a more of a compliance management approach, sort of a movement away from the strict standard, where we're expecting certain things of producers, and also an acknowledgement that at scale premiums are always unlikely to take place. This then leaves me with the question of whether under those circumstances and in different industries, standards will be able to act as regulatory mechanisms of higher cost sustainability practices that haven't been priced in the mainstream market, given that my findings show that it's unlikely to be the case in the coffee industry. I also want to highlight a number of potential avenues for change, and we can also expand on that a little bit. One thing that I think is crucial is that this information asymmetry needs to be improved, and that buyers need to make better commitments and stronger commitments to the sustainable practices and the sustainable sourcing patterns that they seem to be having. So what happened in coffee was that buyers made a bunch of commitments early on, but then expanded from committing to one standard to committing to any type of sustainability scheme, and they would go look for the cheapest type of certified coffee in the market at the time, which provided little demand stability for coffee growers. And they did so in an understanding that otherwise they would be increasing prices at the field, right? So this is a quote from a US roaster who said that their goal was to source sustainable coffees without falsely increasing the price paid at origin, whereas what farmers thought that they would get when they would pursue these sustainability practices were increased prices paid at origin. So I think this is something that needs to be addressed, and I think we'll move more into that during the question time as well. And another interesting avenue forward is a heightening of producing country collective action. In 2017, the World Coffee Producers Forum met for the first time, which was convened by the Colombian Coffee Federation. And here they also acknowledged that there might need to be a banding together, given that the reality of very low prices and very high price volatility in physical markets is just not going away. And so there used to be historical antecedents for more producing country collective action. Of course, those historical antecedents with the International Coffee Agreement relied strongly on US and Brazilian support, neither of which seem currently in a place to provide that political support. So a big question mark on how to move forward in that space. But still, there are avenues for change, and there are also, again, avenues for standards to do better themselves. But I think we need to reconsider what they're trying to do and how they're trying to do it. If you want more, how to get the book, so it's available for purchase via the Cambridge website. You can grab a screenshot of this discount code. It's not very hard, Grabs 2020. You get 20% off. Cambridge has an ebook, but it's also available on Kindle via Amazon. And of course, if you're an academic, you should find access in your institutional libraries. So it's part of the Cambridge core curriculum. So some institutions, I know they already have access to the ebook because there's sort of a collective purchasing agreement. If not, on the Cambridge website, there's also an option to request a hard copy from your library. So all of the grad students out there, I would encourage you to go ahead and do that. And if neither of those options work for you and you're financially constrained but are very interested in these insights, please get in touch and we'll find out a way to get you to the findings, you know, in a different way. Last but not least, I really want to acknowledge all of the help that I got during this process. This is a collective enterprise and it wouldn't be possible otherwise. So from our Trans-Sustain researcher team and all of our research assistants in the field, Again, acknowledging Professor Thomas Dietz, who led and still leads the Transsustain Researcher Group. There's now 2 more PhD students that are doing follow-up studies, which will have exciting results. I'd also like to acknowledge the SIMS group at Inkai Business School, the Center for Sustainable Market Intelligence, who have been invaluable in their support. And of course, all of our anonymous supporters and the anonymous people that have helped us in the field. Muchísimas gracias. And this is a collective undertaking. I hope that it's useful to make your voices heard a little bit. Great, so let's move towards questions. And I think Graeme will go first with some comments, after which Stefano will come. And again, we'll do a couple of questions back and forth between the 3 of us. And then we'll move towards questions from the audience. I saw that there's already some that are coming up. I'll also stop sharing my screen for now so that we can see each other a bit more properly. All right, thank you so much.
Thanks, Janina. First off, congratulations. It's wonderful to be a part of this virtual launch in this altered reality we all live in at the moment. And I'm going to keep my comments very brief. I just want to say it's hard to overstate the importance of this book. It's a really phenomenal piece of work that I was happy to be a part of, reading early drafts and seeing it emerge in the form that it is now published is very exciting. And as other people have said, including Tim Bartley, this is really, in my mind and others, that signals a sort of a maturing of work on private regulation, in that it's a wonderful piece that pays tribute to a long and rich literature that has grappled with understanding this phenomena from its origins to how it's developing to its specific manifestations in different countries, to one that tries to kind of take stock of those considerations and give us a sophisticated understanding of where we stand right now and what that means for the future. So to home in on that a little bit more, I think the thing that Janina has done so successfully in this work is that she has brought together a very rich empirical analysis that gives us a feeling, a sense of what's happening at the individual farm level, that is really focused on this question of impact, but isn't constrained alone to that question of impact. That it's also trying to understand, well, how do we understand impact in the context of this particular phenomena, and how do we think about the dynamics of this distinct regulatory form that has similarities to standard regulatory practices that you might see in a government context, but has different factors to consider, including the ones that Janina laid out for us very nicely at the beginning in her presentation. So the real strength of this work is its deep empirical sophistication that enables Janina to give us new insights to questions that have been in the literature for a long time. It doesn't necessarily answer all of those questions in a way that means that this is the end of research, but it really serves as a wonderful platform for others to dig further, to think about and take stock of things that we thought were sort of accepted in the literature that we might need to rethink. So for all of you who have not read it, both coffee interests specifically, but also private regulatory standards more generally, this is a piece of work that will be important for a long time to come. And I think the other thing that this work does that I want to say from a research design perspective that's very powerful is it gives us an understanding of its scope that enables us to understand its implications more broadly in a very clear and transparent way. So Janina really helps us understand why the 3 countries that she examines and the farmers that she examines in those countries do and do not speak to the general coffee sector as a whole. And that, I think, is really important, because I know in the side questions, some people have been asking questions about the national institutional context. And I think the fact that she has brought sort of a comparative politics sensibility to the questions she's answering or asking, in as well as an impact evaluation sensibility, gives her a really powerful position to be able to say, well, this is what I found, this is how it's situated in a national context, and if we took away that national context, what might we observe in another context? So I think that's also a really strong piece of the work, is the fact that we understand the research design really clearly, such that we can know the scope considerations and think through what the implications are beyond the coffee sector and beyond the specific countries that have been examined. So again, just to close my initial comments, this is a great book, a great project. If you don't know of Janina's work at this point, you should be following her every move, because this is going to be one of many great projects to come. And I will now pass it over to Stefano to add his remarks and kick us off with some questions.
Thanks, Graeme. I would like to start by saying, again, that I really enjoyed reading your book, and I can't dissuade myself from repeating some of Graeme's points, and I highly recommend that this audience today read it. I especially appreciated your overlap of interest and approaches that you took in the book, a combination of political economy and interest in sustainable agriculture, and a peek into and opening up some of the key debates in global governance. Personally, reading a book on coffee is always a pleasure, and this one has been real pleasure. I can assure you that this is a go-to book when it comes to coffee. I realized how much updating I needed to really understand what the coffee industry is now, so I really appreciated the possibility of doing that. On a theoretical and analytical part, I learned many new aspects on rational choice and institutional theories, and especially as you apply them at the micro level. So that was an interesting insight from my perspective. And in terms of the style, it's the book is detailed, and I think it's a plus if you ask me. And I especially liked Janina's hearing your book. It's not a dry book; it's very much alive. And geez, the amount of work you put into this project and writing is just amazing. In the South, plus all the work in the global North, hundreds of interviews, lots of secondary data and stats. And not only that, it does not read as a dissertation book, as you cleaned off a lot of the stuff that should not go into a proper monograph. So it does not read like a thesis, it reads like a proper book. So in short, congratulations. I'll keep it short. I am to the great audience that we have today. So I'm gonna move swiftly to my first comment / question, and then have Graeme to ask one as well. So the question is this: I appreciated the multi-tiered analysis of functional regulatory governance. And even if we focus on tier one, the lower common in terms of what we find making a difference in the field, I wondered to what extent we know for sure that environmental and social outcomes actually improve, as opposed to the fact that certification instruments covers these particular items. And I'm asking this because there's been quite a good bit of debate in the past decade on the difference between outputs. So we keep measuring how many different certifications, changes in practices themselves, and outcomes. Does it really make a difference on the environment, on socioeconomic status of the farmers? So even after the implementation of the ISL impact code of conduct, bringing in some new research on clear picture. And I would like for you to talk a bit more about an impact perspective and how your rich set of empirical results contribute to that. And I'll pass it on to Graeme again.
Okay, so I think I'll just answer that question, then we can move on to Graeme with the next one, if that's okay. Thank you first so much, both of you, for your nice comments. I know that we had a bit of trouble hearing Stefano from time to time, but I think now our connection should be stable again. So the question that as I understand it, just to repeat if people were kind of catching up due to the bandwidth issues, are to talk a bit more about the impact element of and how to measure impact properly. And Stefano mentioned that many times we know about the potential output of certifications, that is, they're certifying farmers. Many times we know, and less often we know, farmers have changed their practices, these outcomes, and then what are the actual impacts, right? So can we trace the impacts all the way down to environmental improvements? I try to do this as much as possible to expand the impact definition, or like the study of impacts, both forward and backwards along this chain of input, output, outcome, impact. So many of the times, even when we're talking about impact evaluation literature, what we're talking about are outcomes, so changes in practices. And that is indeed still the main part of my empirical data as well. So I will look into, did the farmer implement soil preservation practices? Did they try to prevent erosion by putting in barriers into place, for instance? But on certain elements, I do indeed look into impact as well. That is, how have these practices impacted the farm environment as we can perceive it? And for this, we asked our data collectors to do a walkthrough through the coffee farm itself and also take images of the conditions of the coffee farm. So for instance, we do have evidence of erosion as an indirect impact factor, right? So do we see that there's very high or low incidences of erosion that may have been affected by the erosion prevention measures? There are also indicators on the levels of agroforestry that are present in a coffee farm, which could have been impacted by farmers planting more trees. And there are also a number of socioeconomic data. So for instance, we calculated the poverty probability index, which looks at a number of indicators jointly to estimate, do these producers have a higher or lower likelihood to live under the poverty line as estimated in the nation. I also try to move backwards a bit in this chain and talk a bit about how output leads to outcomes by asking farmers whether they had received training on certain elements, and then see whether this training coincided and correlated with improvements in practices. So I think this is definitely one of those elements that, especially in the impact evaluation literature, we're moving towards, to have these like chains of like a causal chain, and to measure every little step along the causal chain. One of the drawbacks, of course, so in this thesis work, I was only able to collect data at one point in time, and ideally you would have data over time so that you could have a panel model and see, did the current training then impact practices in the future. What I did was use recall data, which means that I asked farmers to remember in the last 5 years on what kind of trainings they received. But fortunately, in our Transsustain project, we're now actually two new PhD students that are coming in are collecting a new wave of data. So we'll have a panel data pretty soon, and then that can enrich the insights even further. Maybe that.
Yeah, Janina, I'm happy to follow up on Stefano's question, but instead of asking the question I had in mind, I'm just going to corral a few of the comments from the side chat for you, because there's been a lot of interest in your 3 tiers of standards, and particularly I think interesting questions emerging about some of them about measurement. So different, one question that centered on how do can we think about different baselines impacting the nature of a standard either fitting in one or other tier. So in one situation might the a standard that was an investment standard actually be a win-lose standard because of the baseline situation. So questions about that. And then a series of questions around essentially sort of negative trade-offs or interactions amongst the standards. So I guess in essence, if we focus, can we have everything? Can we is it possible to optimize and prioritize all these different standards? So social and environmental, cost-saving standards, investment standards, win-lose standards, or are there trade-offs? And what does that mean for how we think about impact studies and reflecting on the effectiveness of private regulation when we might see improvements in some cases, but maybe those are having negative effects on our ability to accomplish other goals, right? Other effects. So a series of questions around that aspect of your work and what insights you might have. So I'd be keen for you to respond to that.
Thanks, Graeme, for putting them together like that. Yeah, it's great to have an opportunity to talk a bit more about that, because this the trifecta of practices and also of definitions of sustainability came from a real dilemma that I had at the beginning of the work, which was to decide, do I evaluate standards merely on their stated mandate, and do I only look into what kind of features they're actually asking producers to pursue, or do I go a bit broader in thinking about what has this sector as a whole, what have not civil society organizations asked for in the past, and what have standards initially responded to as this governance gap. And so that's why I started this work by really looking back into the history of who has defined what kinds of practices as sustainable coffee production. And so, of course, like to respond to do different standards historically and due to different baselines focus on different things, definitely, right? So as I was saying a little bit, the fact that standards have moved into sort of the stepwise approach has definitely also focused their efforts a little bit. So standards like 4C that see themselves as an introductory standard that provides a first leg up to farmers, they do definitely focus more on this tier 1 of professionalization, of trying to get higher quality, higher yields. Some others, such as the original ETH standards, was also very much focused on good agricultural practices and not necessarily as much on the type of strong sustainability, the win-lose practices. And again, to give them credit, they initially defined themselves as such. The problem is that they came into competition with other standards that were using the same term, but had very different ideas in mind of what the sustainable coffee sector would then look like, including standards that had a very strong mandate on reforming the value chain, such as fair trade, including standards that had quite a strong definition of environmentally sustainable practices, including a strong focus on agroforestry. And one of the things that I do in the book is trace how the focus on agroforestry and shade coffee has almost vanished from the conversation compared to 20, 30 years ago, when it was indeed one key element of the definition of sustainable coffee. And the reason that has taken place is indeed because there has been this movement from industry as well as from other types of more, let's say, industry-friendly standards to shift the conversation away from the necessity of paying higher prices. At least that's the way that I've perceived it. In terms of the second question, right, of like, do we have trade-offs between the different practices? For sure. And that, again, becomes clear in that, let's give you the example of Costa Rica. They have made crazy efforts to improve the professionalization of their coffee farms because they have a very high cost level. They have very high wages compared to their neighbors. They do have a stronger legislative system, and so the only way for them to survive economically is, one, to focus on very high quality, but also to be extremely efficient and to push their output. And so they have, very keenly adopted sort of this sustainable intensification mantra, and are now in a place where they're trying to put back into place shade trees, but always with a mandate to not harm the yield levels. And if we compare that to some more traditional forms of coffee in Honduras, where in some of those communities I did see very, very sustainable agroforestry farms, yet they're losing money even at lower prices because they have very low yields comparatively. And so if you kind of have to at some point decide on those two ways, like which path you want to pursue. And unfortunately, so far, it does not seem that the market recognizes clearly that the strong sustainability path just has a completely different price profile, and instead it's sort of become mixed up in all these other forms of quote unquote sustainability that have emerged in more recent years.
Janina, would you like another question, or do you want to draw from the audience? It's up to you.
Let's have another question from you, Stefano, and then maybe again, it would be great if you guys could pitch in from the audience. Maybe Graeme could do another one of those. That'd be great. Thanks.
And let me know if I'm breaking out again. I tried a different way of connecting, so it should be fine now. So my question is related to your micro-institutional perspective, which is quite helpful when it comes to explaining incentives that work at a farm level and the related institutional market interventions that could address those to stimulate behavior change, which is the key sort of empirical side and analytical part of your book. Now, if I come this way, a lot of responsibility then is placed on the shoulders of farmers, right? It's their behavioral change that is the key entry point. Would you elaborate on how how we could actually turn a little bit more on the responsibility over the lead firms and how we engage in perhaps a more fundamental critique of the business models that they operate and their increasing financialization. You of all people had taught me the kind of things that Jab Holdings is doing now, that they're acting more like a hedge fund than a commodity. Kind of behavioral change at the farmer level. And then I know that you engage in the latter part of the book on what can be done, but what are the institutional and perhaps instead of farmers' responses? Thank you.
Thanks, Stefano. So basically, again, there was a little bit of feedback back and forth. Stefano's question is about whether what can we do in terms of focusing on the lead firm, the roasters, rather than, because my theoretical framework puts the farmer very much front and center, and sort of the lead firms are background actors that are influencing the incentives that farmers are facing. And it's interesting because Stefano and I have worked on this together, and we've actually written a paper for people that are interested on the evolution of power in the global coffee value chain and production network. So from that perspective, of course, you can't do everything in one book. And with this theoretical framework, the lead firms do fall a bit into the back, although I did try to continuously go back to how, again, their corporate responses have been influencing these farm level indicators, both in the chapter on changing the market, but also in terms of they're also very key, again, in shaping the conversation around sustainability. What kind of practices of these lead firms have contributed to this dilemma? Of course, again, and this is anytime I talk to people that are in the coffee industry, what they'll tell me is, well, it remains a business. And so, of course, we'll go to the place where we can get the coffee at the quality that we want at the cheapest price possible. And the beauty of having a commodity product is that it's interchangeable. So if I go to Indonesia one year and I go to Kenya the next, if I am able to mix together the flavor profile that my consumers want, that is my business model. And this expectation of roasters maintained, at least for the larger roasters, maintained constant across all of these sustainability debates. So for instance, one of the reasons that Starbucks was being lobbied very strongly by fair trade to add in more fair trade or to commit to fair trade coffee, and but fair trade only works with cooperatives, and Starbucks said we can't just buy from cooperatives. We need a stronger base in order to differentiate and diversify our purchasing options, which now Fairtrade USA has decided to split from Fairtrade International and certify plantations. One reason amongst this is to access these types of roasters that have been steadfast in their refusal to rethink conventional market systems. So I hear your point, Stefano, that standards alone won't be able to do the job without lead firms rethinking their mandate and their purchasing practices in strong ways. We do see, and with another co-author, Elizabeth Bennett, we've looked into firms that have taken a different approach in terms of using new forms of profit sharing along the value chain to benefit both the farmer as well as the intermediary actor, and then provide consumers with new ways of contributing to a more fair economic system. Again, I think those isolated cases continue to exist, and they continue to strengthen their voice, especially now that we have re-entered a coffee price crisis. So currently we're in a coffee price crisis that has, I would say, moved the debate forward quite dramatically, also in terms of a shared responsibility approach between the entire industry on farm level livelihoods that hasn't really been there that much in the past, but it's still very much in an early stage. And I think in your written question, you also mentioned, what kind of institutional arrangements would we need for those firms to change their practices? And there, I would say, of course, this is one case where regulatory action in the global north can make a lot of difference. So we've seen a bunch of new legislative initiatives that does hold multinational corporations to greater responsibility also for impacts in their value chains. In France, in Switzerland, we currently have a corporate responsibility initiative on the table. In Germany, they're considering releasing companies that purchase sustainable products from the coffee tax. So I think this is where lobbying northern governments to take lead firms into a bit of a closer bind would be an effective way forward. So we can also move away from sort of this, well, the producing country governments aren't doing enough, so I guess we can only turn to private governance, and if that doesn't work, everything is lost.
Janina, I'll jump in with a follow-up question to that, and I think I'll try and weave in some of the comments from the chat board. So there's two sides to this, and let me frame this question in the context of lessons from your study for the broader phenomena of private market-driven regulation. Ans Kolk asked a question early on about your category of a single standard and how we can possibly imagine that happening given the diversity of interests in separate standardization processes. And this speaks to Stefano's question about the power of major buyers or other players in the value chain. But I think the other side of this is sort of the national context, the nature of coffee production in a global commodity chain where production is often separated from consumption. Whereas in other sectors where we've seen this play out, that isn't the case, right? Where, you know, you have domestic production and domestic consumption, say in the forest product sector or in fisheries or in other commodity sectors where it isn't that same structure of a value chain. So I'm curious, this is an open question you can take in different directions, but there's an institutional dimension here. How do we imagine, how do these systems develop? Is it even possible to have a single standard, that category? What lessons from coffee can we take for that question? And then also reflecting on sort of what are the things that we need to be aware of at the national level, the national context, and maybe the sector specific dimensions that do or do not drive. So this is a big canvas for you to fill, but I think there's some interest in those sorts of features of your work and what your work tells us about those broader questions. So sorry for being all over the place, but I'm trying to weave things together for you.
No, that's great. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I asked myself that question a lot, and it's quite funny because during the PhD process, you're really so much with your nose in the weeds that you're like, Arabica coffee is the only thing that matters. And of course, you know, like everybody will be interested in that. But it's been nice to kind of emerge out of this. Currently, I'm working on palm oil, actually, another commodity, and buyer-driven sustainability regulation in that field. And so I've definitely asked myself that. So let me start by saying, I think the most the insights will travel will be to value chains that, as Graeme, you were saying, have similar features, both in terms of north-south dimensions of production and consumption, a production base that is mainly smallholder farmers in the global south, and moreover, the idea that there's a consumer-facing product, that consumers might pay more for the product, and that it is an industry where differentiation is something that producers are also thinking about. So I think that would hold true for the cocoa sector, for instance, for tea, for other types of tropical commodities that I do know less about, but I think cashews, for instance, there's a number of tropical commodities that these same standards have moved into many times after coffee, that the insights hold best. In terms of the question, right, of is a super seal even a possibility, it is a bit of a historical question. I think your work, Graeme, showed that quite well, because you did this comparative study of the path dependency of how standards evolve, and that the fact that coffee had very distinct communities that were concerned with sustainability early on made it very difficult for them to find the potential for a super seal. But they did try. So they tried in the early 90s, if I'm not mistaken, to come together to first Sustainable Coffee Congress. They sat around the table at that point. It was the organic community, the fair trade community, and the shade-grown coffee community. And there's quite some interesting archival documents that show they just did not see eye to eye. They were already much too invested in their original initiatives. And so that question of is a super seal possible, I think it's a historical one. In coffee, I don't see it happening anymore, although we do see some interesting developments, for instance, with UTZ and Rainforest Alliance merging. These 2 years ago now, I think they announced it in 2018, and then they went through with it in 2019. And this came against another proliferation of more industry-focused initiatives, and it seemed, at least from the outside, as a merger driven by the recognition that they were stronger together, whereas in the past they had very much thought that they would be stronger apart. So I think it always depends a bit also on the factors surrounding them, and especially their competitors, in which direction these types of organizations move. In terms of industries where the insights might hold less, again, those might be the ones where they had a super seal from the beginning. So with the palm oil value chain, I'm now learning much more about the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. And here we find interesting developments that it is the go-to forum. So there are discussions happening around global sustainability that are only happening in that forum, at least for industries that are focusing on the food sector. And so these like internal competition dynamics don't occur as much, although the oversupply, the loss in premium, and the low payoff, especially for smallholder farmers, is still also present in the palm oil case, despite the fact that they had a bit more of a congruent system. And definitely, you know, it's probably harder to translate these types of findings into the forestry or the fisheries case, which have their own dynamics. In terms of the national level, was this national level in terms of producing countries or more? Yeah, so.
Yeah, there was a question, just someone was curious. You'd flagged the fact that you could speak more to the national context, and I think there was interest in a little bit more of an elaboration on that feature of your work.
Perfect. So I chose 3 countries from a comparative element, and the basis of my comparison was both the overall institutional and good governance environment, where we can rank Honduras as being very low according to a number of indicators that it didn't make up, but that were sort of like the World Governance Index, etc. Colombia as middle, and Costa Rica as having the highest institutional environment, considering good governance in general. And so, I mean, it is considered, you know, the Switzerland of Central America. It has very stable democratic functions compared to its neighbors. The second element that I was interested in was the institutional environment that is supporting the coffee industry, because what we sometimes forget is that producing countries have strong interest in their export industries as well, and will do a lot to support those export industries, which will then many times be the type of commodity that is trying to be regulated by sustainability standards. And so here, again, we have Honduras that has quite a free market system, Colombia that has a very strong coffee institution, the Federación Nacional de Cafeteros de Colombia, the National Coffee Growers Association, which, however, they have a strong mandate on extension services and on providing markets and a purchasing guarantee, but they do not interfere that much in price setting. Whereas in Costa Rica, they have had laws governing the coffee trade since the 60s, and it is very much hands-on. A number of my interviewees called it socialist, because the Costa Rican law determines the profit rates of every single intermediary before you go down to the farm level, in order to ensure that farmers get the highest potential price of the fresh on board, the export price. And so in these different national level institutional environments, it was quite interesting to hear how they managed the standards differently. For instance, in Honduras, when we looked at price levels, this was one of the cases where producers were getting the highest premiums just because it was this free market environment allowed for the transmission of prices quite efficiently. Whereas in Costa Rica, because of the fact that the government was controlling export prices and was controlling price transmission, it was a bit murkier to identify and then isolate certified producers from the rest of the cooperative that were not certified. And so there were several ways around that. Sometimes cooperatives did not pay out individual level premiums to producers. They would just say, well, you know, we're in solidarity, and we're going to reinvest all of these Rainforest Alliance premiums back into a co-op. But then, of course, the farmers still have the more stringent requirements that they need to get. And so that was an interesting insight that I wasn't aware of before, that this national level pricing regulation really makes a strong impact on the way that standards are able to function. Also, the amount of effort that the national level institution puts into place to get farmers certified in the first place. This is where the FNC in Colombia stands out a lot. They run their own certified groups. So if there's both the cooperatives are very strong, but if there is no cooperative in a specific region, the Federación will become the standard, the certificate owner basically for a group of smallholder farmers, and will provide a lot of support. And in some regions that we were in, farmers were groaning over the amount of capacity building that they received, because every single week there was some other NGO and some other government agency providing that. So, and then as a third element, every farmer still needs to work within their particular environment, legal environment as well. And many times standards refer to a legal compliance as a minimum, and this includes minimum wages. And in those three countries, in Honduras, minimum wage is around $8 per day. Costa Rica, it's 18 per day. And then in Colombia, it's somewhere in the middle. And they're still, again, selling their coffee into the same international market, for a certified coffee, but they face very different underlying costs, which again makes compliance that much harder for producers in higher cost environments. So those are some of the takeaways, as short as possible, to draw out.
I think, Stefano, you had one last question. I know that Janina, are we okay for time, or what are your...
Yeah, I think we should be wrapping up pretty quickly to let people end their day. But what I will do is, before closing this, I'll collect the rest of the questions that were in the chat box, and I'll just do some sort of blog post on my website, and I'll link to it via Twitter as well. So then all of the questions will be able to be answered anyhow.
Thanks, Janina. I think we can skip my last questions. I mean, there are so many questions, so much more. There's so much interest in this, and I was scrolling back on the chat. There is a lot of other stuff that should go before I say that my question. So I think we can wrap it up here if you wish.
Great. In that case, again, I will look at and extract from the chat all of your lovely comments. Look for them on my website, janinagrabs.com. Feels like one of those like weird advertising things. Or again on Twitter at Janina Grabs, so just for you to be able to find it again. And I'll leave the chat open for a couple more minutes if people have anything else to add. Otherwise, thank you so much for participating and your interest, and reach out if there's anything more you want to know. Thank you so much, Graeme and Stefano.
Congratulations, an amazing book.
Bye.